Hello London, we are ready for your vote.
Hello, I'm Stephen Perkins, and this is Douze Points, the Eurovision podcast from the team behind Binge Watch. It is Monday, 7th of October, and we are back with another new episode. This time, I'm going to be taking a look at a year that I think is a bit of a turning point in the history of the contest. But first, let's take a quick look at the latest headlines. Finnish broadcaster YLE has confirmed that it has received a record number of submissions for Finland's pre-Eurovision selection process, Uuden Musiikin Kilpailu, or UMK for short. 485 songs have been submitted for consideration, which is a peak under the contest's current format, but only 7 of them will advance to the main stage of the competition. It's currently the job of a panel of industry experts to whittle them down, and the finalists will be announced on 8th of January, with the final scheduled to take place 1 month later on 8th of February 2025. Montenegro has also had a banner year for artist interest in their pre-selection, with a record of 36 entries being submitted for Montesong 2024, although 4 of them have since been disqualified for not meeting the rules of the contest. Up to 16 songs will be chosen to be performed in the grand final, which is being scaled back slightly by broadcaster RTCG from a 2-night event to 1 night only, with the selection due to take place on 27th November, likely to be the first official song confirmed for Eurovision 2025, unless somebody else springs a surprise on us. Montenegro have been absent from the contest since 2022 and haven't qualified for the final since Knez with Adio back in 2015. Finally, Brotherhood of Man lead singer Martin Lee has died, aged 77. A statement posted on the band's Facebook page reported that he died of heart failure after a short illness, adding he will be sadly missed by his fellow band members Nicky Stevens, Lee Sheridan, and especially Sandra Stevens, to whom he had been married for 45 happy years. Brotherhood of Man won Eurovision for the United Kingdom in 1976 with Save Your Kisses for Me. Now, long-term listeners to this podcast, and hopefully there are at least a few of you, can probably remember me threatening on several occasions to do a deep dive into the 1993 contest at some point. There's a reason for this, and that's because I find Eurovision 1993 uniquely fascinating on a number of levels. Not only was it staged in the smallest habitation ever in the history of the contest, the Irish town of Millstreet, with a then population of just 1,500 people, but it was also the very first Eurovision to introduce an element that we now take for granted, a pre-qualifying round ahead of the grand final on Saturday night. I've decided to tackle this topic across 2 episodes because it felt too big for a single podcast, so we're going to start this week with an episode all about the pre-selection, and then next time we'll take a look at the main contest itself. So let's get the key questions out of the way first. Why did the 1993 contest need a qualifying round, and why is it that a lot of people in the UK weren't really aware that it even happened? Well, the number of countries competing at Eurovision and wanting to compete at Eurovision have been slowly increasing during the late 80s and early 90s, and the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union had created even more newly independent nations who wanted a slice of the action, feeling that participating in the Eurovision Song Contest would help to increase their profile in the wider world. However, with Eurovision bosses wanting to keep the already fairly lengthy broadcast under control, they couldn't afford to just admit everyone who wanted to do it, but they were willing to raise the cap on the number of competing nations from 22 to 25. There were still more countries wanting to compete than there were spaces available, so Eurovision came up with a temporary solution, a one-off contest specifically for countries wishing to make their Eurovision debut in 1993. The contest was named, and please forgive me here because my Slovenian is as good as it ever was, Eurosong 93 Kwalifikacja za Millstreet, or pre-selection for Millstreet, and it was held in the Slovenian capital of Ljubljana on 3rd of April 1993 in Studio 1 at Televizija Slovenia. Around 14 countries originally expressed an interest in taking part, including Belarus, the Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia and Ukraine. However, by February, for various reasons, the number of entries had dropped to 6, consisting of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, Romania and Slovenia. Bulgaria ended up dropping out before the list of competitors was finalised, and Estonia and Slovakia joined late in the process, leaving a total of 7 countries vying for the 3 spots that had opened up in Eurovision 1993. Although this was an official Eurovision event, it was a lot more low-key than you might expect. It was broadcast primarily to the countries that were taking part, with only a few non-competing nations like Denmark, Portugal, Spain and Cyprus deciding to air the event, which is why even if you were around and actively watching Eurovision on the BBC in 1993, you might not really have been aware that any of this was happening. I certainly wasn't. But, of course, the internet is a wonderful thing, and the programme has been uploaded to YouTube in its entirety. So, this week I sat down and watched Kwalifikacja za Millstreet for the first time. Thank you to YouTuber Real Farley for uploading what's pretty much a broadcast quality copy of the show, and I've put a link into the episode description for anyone who fancies checking it out for themselves. The first thing I would say about it is that it definitely has the air of a 1990s era national final rather than a kind of mini Eurovision. It's held in a fairly modest TV studio, and the studio audience, which doesn't appear to be vast, seems to consist primarily of guests in smart casual clothing who don't appear to respond very much apart from the occasional smattering of quietly respectful applause. In other words, it's all rather subdued and earnest, which isn't a bad thing, but when you're watching it from a modern perspective and you're used to arena-sized semi-finals full of fans who know all the words to even the more obscure entries, it does feel a little bit strange. I think the tone of the piece is set right from the off, given the fact that we're treated to around 4 minutes of sweeping, majestic travelogue footage, presumably a combination of shots from the 7 different competing nations. It's accompanied by an instrumental soundtrack that's clearly been composed to inspire awe and reverence, although at one point it does veer slightly into a pastiche of Thank You for the Music, I think. Clearly, the whole point of this is to promote these countries as being on a par with the Western nations already taking part at Eurovision, showing off their natural beauty as well as their developed cities. And I'm all for that, although I would say this section does go on rather longer than it needs to. I appreciate that, again, I'm watching this from a 2024 viewpoint, and the televisual landscape was very different in 1993, where things weren't quite so cutthroat, and you could afford to spend a bit more time on what amounts to not a lot more than lovely scenery without fearing that the audience is going to get bored and change the channel. But there was a point where I found myself wondering if this was some kind of standby footage that they kept on hold in case the broadcast fell off the air at any point. Anyway, eventually they bring up the title card, which has the name of the event in both Slovenian and English, and then we cut to the studio, where our presenter for the night, Tajda Lekshi, enters and greets us, first of all in Slovenian, before switching to English.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Studio 1 of T Slovenia, where is to be held this year's pre-selection for the Eurovision Song Contest.
Tajda tells us that the running order for tonight's event was decided by a random draw, although it basically turned out to be in alphabetical order apart from Slovenia and Slovakia switching places. So, we open with Bosnia and Herzegovina. We do get a pre-performance postcard of sorts, and what's interesting is that the nations appear to have been given carte blanche here to submit whatever they felt appropriate. There's not really an overarching theme to them, and even the visual style can be quite different from country to country. Bosnia and Herzegovina's is certainly an outlier in that it contains both shots of beautiful countryside and shots of buildings on fire. In other words, they're not so much treating it as a tourism opportunity as a chance to remind viewers watching at home that Bosnia is in the middle of a war, which is quite a bold move. After each postcard, we cut back to Tajda in the studio for a brief intro to the song. She tells us in this case that the song by Fazla, entitled Svabor Svijeta, translates into All the World's Pain, and it's about how all of the pain of the world is in Bosnia right now, but the message of the song is to remain optimistic and not get dragged down by that. The song itself is a pretty catchy kind of a synth rock number that's staged very effectively within the confines of the setup. I really like the way the backing singers in red jackets are standing very still, but at the same time being really expressive in their arm movements. I think overall it's a pretty encouraging start to the contest. Croatia are on second with Don't Ever Cry by Put, which we are told is Croatian for road. Now, their postcard is constructed very differently from Bosnia and Herzegovina's. It's definitely got more of a Windows Movie Maker vibe to it, with various Croatian beauty spots swooping across a static background while the word Croatia occasionally scrolls up and down the sides. Back in the studio, Tajda explains that this song too is about not giving up on hope. So I'm very much sensing a theme to tonight's entries, and then the band strike up. It's a very sweet, earnest ballad with the verses in Croatian and the chorus mostly in English. It's quite a static performance, apart from one slightly strange piece of choreography in the middle eight where each of the singers turns around on the spot with their heads kind of trailing behind them a little bit. I don't fully get what that's about, but otherwise, this is another decent effort. Estonia are up next, and their postcard is more of a midpoint between the previous two. It's not quite as stylised as Croatia's, nor is it as harrowing as Bosnia and Herzegovina's. It's much more of a straightforward sequence of shots of Estonian beauty spots. Now, at this point I should probably mention that it's a bit of a linguistically confusing evening. Tajda presents in, as far as I can discern, a combination of Slovenian, French and English, and you don't always get all three languages in each break, so there are some where no English is spoken at all. Estonia's intro is one of those, but there are enough familiar words in there for me to know that Tajda is telling us that singer Jannika Silmar recently played Mary Magdalene in Jesus Christ Superstar. The song is called Muritut Miltja Sudamitult, which seems to translate into something like a carefree mind and a heart of fire. This is another one that I really like. She's got a lovely voice and it's all very sweet, and really the only criticism I can level at this performance is that she's a little bit too static on the stage, but other than that, a very strong entry. From there we go to Hungary, and where some of the previous postcard videos have had much more of a kind of contemporary style soundtrack to them, this one feels much more rooted in the country's own musical traditions. Although, having said that, it does get a little bit funkier towards the end. They also have footage of lots of black horses running through the landscape, so you could be forgiven for thinking it's a Lloyd's Bank advert. Representing Hungary is Andrea Sulak with Ava Regel, or Lonely Morning, which Taida explains is a song about lost love. This one feels very Eurovision-y for this particular era. It's a torch song ballad that sounds a little bit like Eric Carmen's All By Myself, with the chorus taking a slight turn more towards Superstar by the Carpenters. And from there we go to my personal standout of the evening, Romania. Now their postcard is nothing much to write home about, it's your usual mix of sun, snow and exciting wildlife, but what their postcard lacks in excitement, they more than make up for with their representative, Dida Dragan singing Nu Pleca or Don't Leave. Right from the word go, she is absolutely eating and leaving no crumbs, although there is an unfortunate piece of microphone feedback quite early on in the performance. I don't know whether the juries were voting on dress rehearsal footage or on what they actually saw on the night, but if it was the latter, that can't have helped Romania's chances very much. Dida is by far the most animated performer of the night with a very bombastic song. At first I thought she just really wanted to get through to Eurovision, but honestly, as the evening draws on, I think she's just kind of like that as a performer. In the penultimate spot are Slovenia, our hosts for this evening, with Ti Dejavan Dan, or A Quiet Rainy Day by 1X Band. And again, what's happening on stage is much more attention-grabbing than the fairly unremarkable postcard that comes before it. There are some seriously gaudy shirts being worn by this group for starters. The song is pleasant too, it has a slight feel of California Dreamin' to it, and the style of the music in combination with those shirts gives the whole thing a fairly relaxed, tropical vibe, which is quite a nice counterpart to a lot of what we've seen so far tonight. Finally, in position number 7, we have Slovakia's Elan with Amnestia na Neveru, or Love Addiction. Their postcard is quite effective, it's gentle and haunting, although I do find myself a little bit sad that no other nation has quite reached the same levels of graphic design is my passion that the Croatian postcard did. Anyway, Taida tells us that the final song is, and I quote, an apology for infidelity, confusion and pain, which may all be brought about because of love. So, I can't claim I was particularly surprised when this group turned out to consist entirely of men. It's a good, rocky ballad with a very potent chorus, and a lead singer who reminds me of Con O'Neill a little bit. So, that is all 7 of our songs, and we're around 43 minutes into a 95-minute broadcast, so there is still quite a lot of airtime to fill. Remember, at this point in time we were still 1 year away from Riverdance completely redefining the idea of a Eurovision interval act, so people's expectations were probably not that lofty at this point. But I must admit I was quite surprised when Taida announced that while the jury members were considering their scores, the next part of the programme would involve each of the 7 contestants returning to perform another one of their hits in a performance that would not be considered by the juries. It just feels like a really baffling concept to me. I know in a modern interval programme we probably do get a similar number of non-competitive performances, but they tend to be sketches or alumni coming back for a valedictory turn. This just felt like an entire second round that counted for absolutely nothing, which only really existed to pad out the duration of the show. That isn't to say the performances weren't good. In many cases they were, and I was definitely delighted to see Romania's Dida doing something even more dramatic the second time around, kneeling on the floor and going full ham to the point where I thought she might be about to start speaking in tongues. But on the other hand, we had Janika from Estonia, who I think was more of a musical theatre actress than an established pop star, although I could be wrong, performing a cover of Natalie Cole's I Live For Your Love, which was a little bit sharp and actually ended up making me like her earlier performance a bit less in retrospect, though I appreciate that's not a thought I would have been allowed to consider if I had been on the jury. Anyway, I won't dwell on the second round of performances because they aren't really relevant for our purposes. Suffice to say that they happened, and we go on to the important bit, the voting. So here's how that worked. Each of the 7 nations competing sent 1 juror to Slovenia to give their votes in person in the studio. The scoring system was a slightly truncated version of the main one due to having fewer songs, so the lowest number of points available was 5, then 6, then 7, then 8, and the usual jump up to 10 and 12 for the top 2 songs. And, as usual, jurors were not allowed to vote for their own country's entry. It was quite interesting to see the actual jurors on screen in studio giving their scores in full vision. Some of them clearly felt a little bit self-conscious about publicly rating their competitors like this, and it being very clear that this score came entirely from them, since there was no panel of fellow music industry experts they could blame if they were going rogue. I won't go through the results in detail because you can watch the video if you really wanted to see all the ins and outs, but I'll just pick out a couple of interesting points. For one, every single country gave 12 points to a different nation, meaning that each country got a top score once, and only once. In any other scenario at Eurovision, I would suggest that was a case of clear bigotry going on, but honestly, in a sample size this small, the charitable thing to do would be to notch that up purely to coincidence, so that's what I'm going to do. Slovakia emerge as the leaders after the first few rounds of voting, and Romania, despite picking up 12 points from Croatia, pick up most of the 5 points, suggesting fairly early on that they will not be advancing. But what's particularly dramatic is that Slovakia, despite losing the lead briefly to Slovenia, are back on top after 6 rounds of voting, and Slovakia themselves are the final country to vote, and proceed to essentially vote themselves out of contention by giving their top points to their nearest competitors. Even though they couldn't award themselves any points in this round, mathematically they could have stayed in the top 3 if they'd given, say, Romania 12 points, 10 to Hungary, 8 to Estonia, 7 to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and so on. But they opt to give 8 points to Croatia, 10 points to Slovenia, and their 12 to Bosnia and Herzegovina, knocking themselves into 4th place in the process and missing out on qualifying by a margin of 1 point.
The purpose of tonight's performance was to choose 3 songs to be performed on the stage of this year's Eurovision Song Contest, and we've just attained it. The 3 winning songs are A Quiet Rainy Day from Slovenia, performed by MX Band, The Pain of the Whole World from Bosnia and Herzegovina, performed by the group Fazla, and Don't Ever Cry from Croatia, performed by the group Put.
So the scores end up with Slovenia in first place on 54 points, Bosnia and Herzegovina second with 52, Croatia third with 51, Slovakia in fourth with 50, Estonia fifth with 47, Hungary sixth with 44, and Romania in last place with 38 points. Robbed, I tell you. Although the majority of the evening has been very slickly handled, I don't think they can have done a particularly good or thorough job of rehearsing the coronation part of the proceedings, because Tajda clearly wants the winners to join her on stage in ascending order, so third place Croatia first, then Bosnia and Herzegovina in second, and winners Slovenia last of all, but the whole message gets muddled and Bosnia and Herzegovina appear on the stage first. But, despite the fairly chaotic execution, the 3 winning countries are all given a trophy and a bunch of flowers, and eventually Slovenia, as the overall winner, gets to return to the main stage to reprise their song, after Tajda wishes everyone good luck in Millstreet, and we end, perhaps fittingly, with scrolling credits that look like they were written in Comic Sans. So, to summarise, this was for the most part a fairly smoothly run and professional pre-selection process, with a high standard of entries across the board, even if it definitely felt more like a song for Europe than Eurovision itself. But then, I imagine, there wasn't really the budget to make it more of an event than it was, especially with it being very much an untested concept at this point. But, nonetheless, Kwalifikacja za Millstreet laid a lot of the groundwork for the modern concept of a semi-final, even if it took another 11 years for one to actually arrive. Next time, I'll be taking a look at how Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia got on at Eurovision itself, as well as all of the other competing nations in this somewhat unconventional contest. So I hope you'll come back and join me for that one. Thank you as ever for listening. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter at bingewatch_pod and at Stephen Perkins for me personally, and please don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure all of our upcoming episodes are downloaded directly to your device. Until next time, good night Europe and good morning Australia.